Kuf Nun Dalad Amid Base 154b. And we're towards the bottom of the page. It's about 15 lines up. Esvei. Line starts Hava. So we had a story before where Rabba was playing with his son on the side of an animal. It's like letting him slide down the side of an animal. Abaya was surprised at that. He says, Mishtamish Balechayim, you're using an animal on Shabbos. He says, no, it's the side of the animal, and there's no gzeira on the side of the animal. So, said about what about taking off the straps of the animal, to let the packages fall down. So we said that the straps weren't tied that way where you actually need to lean on the animal. Esvei, what is the question? Shtayim b'di adamachas pilan ksheira. Talking about a sukkah. There's different ways of learning this, but one of the ways of learning this is when you have you made two walls of the sukkah, and one of the walls is going from, let's say, tree to tree or something. We're thinking that let's see in a minute what we're thinking. So it says that it's kosher. It's attached to the tree. And you're not allowed to go onto this. The sukkah is kosher. You're not allowed to go into the sukkah on Yom Tov. Rashi translates oilin means to enter. Now, Rashi explains oilin means to enter because sukkahs were made normally on the roof. So Rashi explains it. Without Rashi, I would have said that oilin means to enter because the Aramaic al means to enter. Remember, as a kid, I learned, I heard a rabbi speaking. The Targum on Shmai says, "V'yulein Shmas b'nei Yisrael da'alu l'Mitzrayim," that they went up to Mitzrayim. It says you don't go up to Mitzrayim, you go down to Mitzrayim. So he gave a whole pshat, and you read the Tzarech Aliyah. But afterwards, I looked in a dictionary, and da'alu means to enter. Means to go in. It doesn't mean to go up. Whatever the case is, the sukkah is on the roof, and you're not allowed to go into the sukkah on Yom Tov. One of the walls is a tree. The issue is that people in those days used to place things on the schach. Why you're allowed to do that? But that's what they would do. The problem is that the schach is being supported by the tree, because the wall is the tree. The wall is supported by the tree. So you're not allowed to use the trees on Yom Tov. So my love, is it not? The chakbei be'ilan. It must be that you carved out into the tree, and you put the beams of the wall into the tree, which means the schach is being held on the beams that are attached to the tree. Double it's stadin asurim. It's a kasha and Rabbah. Rabbah said that you're allowed to use the size of the animal, and he was letting his son slide down the animal. You see from the sukkah that you're not allowed to use the side of the tree. Gemara says loy. The kafi le'ilan banach schachi leveik to come shtamish be'ilan. What we're talking about is that you tied the tree in a way that you're putting the boards on the top of the tree. It's not the side of the tree. You tie the trees together, maybe. Yeah. You tie the trees together and you place the boards on the top of the trees that are tied together. So like low trees could be bent over or something. And then the schach boards, things that would be supporting the schach, was placed on that. So that's why you're not allowed to go into the sukkah on Yom Tov, because you may end up using the schach by placing things on the schach, which means using the tree, and you're not allowed to use the tree. Rabbah says you're allowed to use the sides of the tree. He says, yeah, that's the sides. This is the top of the tree. You may be familiar. There's other ways of learning this Mishnah, talking about where the floor of the sukkah is on the tree. I don't know if you learn Mishnah Sukkah, I don't know how they taught it. But there's another pshat. Oilun lam Yom Tov means that you're going up into the sukkah that's supported. It's sort of like a tree house. The floor is supported. That's another way of learning it. But it doesn't make a difference. The same issue is it the top or is it the sides? Gemara says, "Yihachi ema seifa." If that's the case, that using the top of the tree, the seifa of the Mishnah says of the Mishnah in Sukkah, "Shalish b'dei adamachas bilan ksheira v'ein l'biyamtiv." Let's say a sukkah normally has 3 walls in those days. So if you have 3 walls that are man-made, but the 4th wall is made by the tree, so then you're allowed to go into it on Yom Tov. Where it says v'ida kafilila and ma'ila b'Yom Tov. If we're talking about that the 4th wall, you're using the top of the tree, and it's supporting the schach, and you're allowed to go into it on Yom Tov, but you have the schach being supported, the 4th wall is being supported by the tree. And if you use the schach, you're using the tree. So the Gemara says, 1 second. What do you want? What are you trying to tell me? What's your point? You're trying to tell me that can't be the case? Can't be the top of the tree. What do you want to tell me? That it's the side of the tree? Velamite stadin, asurin. You're trying to tell me that the sides of the tree are asur? In other words, if you don't like my pshat in the beginning of the Mishnah, that we said that we're using the top of the tree. So what's your pshat? Your pshat is that you're using the sides of the tree. And the sides of the tree are asur. That's why the first part of the Mishnah, you weren't allowed to go into the sukkah and Yom Tov. The Mishnah is making a difference between if the sukkah has 3 walls or the sukkah has 4 walls. If the sukkah has 4 walls, then you're allowed to. Then why are you allowed to? You're using the top of the tree. So what do you want to say? That using the side of the tree, but the side of the tree is asur? So safe, you don't gain anything. According to your pshat, you have the same question. It's interesting how this even is an option. Elahasam, the Gemara says, "B'gavaza persachna, dilan kufei doifen ba'almahu deshavya." It tells us what's going on over here. We're talking about that you're really not using the tree at all to hold the schach. Talking about that the trees, the trunk and the branches are spreading out, and that just happens to be the 4th wall. You didn't do anything. You don't need the 4th wall. You made a sukkah of 3 walls. It happens to be that there's a 4th wall there. It's totally an unnecessary wall, and it's just spread out there. You're not using it to hold the schach. You don't need it at all, that wall. It's just regular trees. You didn't tie it. It's nothing. We're saying that you're allowed to go into such a sukkah. If you needed it for the wall, then you were tying it and this, and you were putting the schach on it, then that would be asur. That's the first case. So it's a little bit funny because the difference between the first part of the Mishnah and the second part of the Mishnah is if it's the sukkah has 3 walls or 4 walls, is now telling me not the number of walls. It's telling me if I'm using the tree as part of my sukkah. This tree isn't at all part of my sukkah. I don't need the tree, and it just happens to be there. I'm saying that it's no problem. Dekanami, it's also precise. If you read the Mishnah again, it's precise. Diktani zaklal, this is the rule. Kol she'ilu, anything that if she'inata li'ilan yechel lamed ein la b'yom tov shma mina. If you remove the tree and the sukkah will still stand, then you're allowed to go into that sukkah. Here we're talking about a tree that's not supporting the schach at all. You can move the tree. Tree is just like bushes. It's just like that. Okay. Let's say that there is a machlekes tanoim regarding if you're allowed to use the sides of an animal. And an interesting comparison, what the Gemara just did to us. We were talking about an animal, and in order to prove if the sides of an animal are permissible to use, you can't use the top of it, but are you allowed to use the sides? To prove that, we said, what about the sides of a tree? And if the sides of the tree are asur, then that would mean the sides of an animal as well. That was the comparison. It says, let's say that this is really a machlekes tanoim. Ein oilna b'yom tov. It says that you're not allowed to go into the sukkah on Yom Tov. Shimon ben Elazar is a student of Rameir, says you're allowed to go into the sukkah on Yom Tov. What is the machlekes? Didn't tell us the case, but there's a tree here. So it says the Mar Savar Tzdaden Asurin, Mar Savar Mutarin. It must be that there's a machlekes. The sukkah was built by using the sides of the tree. It means they put horizontal beams into the tree. They made like holes or indents in the tree that could hold these boards that would be for the wall of the sukkah. And one opinion says that you're not allowed to go into it. One says that you are allowed to. That means that there's a machlekes if you're allowed to use the sides of a tree. So Amar Abaya Eloi. Abaya says that's not the pshat. The Kuli Alma Stad Nasir. And everyone holds that the sides of the tree is asir. Here we're talking about using the sides of the sides. Okay, what does that mean? Sides of the sides, the Gemara is going to explain in a minute, but it would mean that I have something that's sticking out of the tree. I put a peg into the tree, and I put the boards on that peg. Or maybe the boards itself are not a problem, but because the schach is supported by the boards that are sticking out of the tree, so that's called tzidei tzdadim. It's twice removed from the tree. One opinion holds, that's Rav Shimon ben Elazar, Mishum Rav Meir, that says you're allowed to go into the sukkah. He holds that the sides of the sides are permissible. Other one holds that it's, Asurin is the first opinion, the Tanna Kama, and the Rav Shimon ben Elazar, Mishum Rav Meir says that you're allowed to. That's, he says, the second opinion. We'll see in a moment more clarification about this. Rava says, Manda Aser B'tzdaden Asanam B'tzidei. Rava says, it's the same thing. If you can't use the sides, then you can't use the sides of the sides. Manda Shari B'tzidei Tzdaden, Sharinam B'tzdaden. And if you are allowed to use the sides, then you're allowed to use, if you're allowed to use the sides of the sides, then you're allowed to use the sides as well. It doesn't make this distinction of once removed or twice removed. That's Rava's opinion. Rav Misharshi asked Rav a question. Noatz Yased Be'ilan V'Tolaba Kalkala L'mayla Masar Tvachim Minu Ruveir Mat Miyat Tvachim Ruveir. Listen to this story. We're on top of Kufman Hay. Someone wants to travel 2,000 amas out of the city. So he has to put food over there so he's able to take that walk on Shabbos. Otherwise, you're not allowed to travel 2,000 amas out of the city. So if he puts his food there, it's called the Erev Tchumen. And then he'll be allowed to walk. Now, the only condition, one of the conditions is that you have to be able to eat it. You don't have to eat it. You have to be able to eat it. Now, how are you going to be able to eat this food? Well, it's in a Rosh Hashanah. So it's no problem. You go over there and you can eat it. You can't take it 4 amas, but you can go there and eat it. So if he hangs it on a tree, so there's going to be a problem of him taking it off the tree. That's one issue, taking it off the tree, because it's hanging there. The other issue is, does the tree become a different rishus? The tree becomes a rishus hayachid, somehow, as we'll see. So then you can't take it into the rishus hashanah. You're not in the rishus hayachid. You're not climbing the tree. You're not going onto the tree. You're in the rishus hashanah. You can't take it out of the basket and take it into and eat it. So therefore, your erev isn't going to work. So it says like this: if you stick a peg in the tree, and you hang on it a basket, a kalkala is the basket. Now this basket is 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. That makes it its own rishus. Now, if it's above 10 tvachim, depends on where your peg is. If the peg is above 10 tvachim, or the basket is above 10 tvachim, then it's considered rishus hayachid. Eini rupa erev. It's not a good erev. The Gemara here is introducing erevin. So it's not a good erev. Why? Because you can't access it. You can't eat that food. Then it's erev erev. But if it's below 10 tvachim, then even though the basket is 4 tvachim wide, 4 by 4, but it's still considered in the rishus harabim. Only if it's above 10 tvachim does it become a rishus hayachid. Okay. So far we didn't see anything about using the tree. We didn't get the details yet. Here we're just talking about how high it is. Does it become a different rishus? And can you access it? Taima denatz yased be'ilan. The reason why you're allowed to do this is because you had a peg that was in the tree, and the basket is hanging from the peg. It means you didn't hang the basket directly on the tree. It's called tzidei tzedad. It's use the side of the tree to hang the peg. And then you hang the basket on the peg. So it's twice removed. Halay knots, but let's say you didn't put a peg in the tree. Then even if you tie the basket directly to the tree, then you wouldn't be allowed to allowed to take things from the basket if it's tied directly to the tree. So what are we proving here? It's a kasha on Rava. Rava said that if you hold that you can use the sides of the sides of the sides, then you can use the sides. If you hold that you're not allowed to use the sides, then you're not allowed to use the sides of the sides. In other words, it's very consistent. It's all or nothing. So according to Rava, this Mishnah doesn't fit. Because according to this Mishnah, if it's once removed, it's aser. If it's twice removed, it's mutter. Rava holds that you don't say that. Papa says, here we're talking about a basket that's very tight. Here, if you try to take the bread out of the basket, you're going to end up moving the tree. So that's why it needs to be twice removed. Really, is that the giving tree? What is it? What's happening here is if it's twice removed, it's not because twice removed is mutter. It's because when it's twice removed, you're going to end up moving the peg instead of moving the tree. I guess the peg would be a little loose when you put it in. So the peg is going to move, and the peg is not a problem. The moving of the tree is the problem. Okay, so he answers that Rava could be correct. Rav Papa is a student of Rava. He's a student of Bai also, but he's a student of Rava mainly. So he's answering that it could be that it's, if it's the sides are aser, then the sides of the sides are aser. And if the sides of the sides are mutter, then the side is also mutter. Here we are dealing with a different issue of moving the tree. The halacha is you're allowed to use the sides of the sides, but not the side. Who held that? Which opinion was that made this difference? That was the opinion of Abaya. The sides are aser. The sides of the sides are mutter. Rava held if one is aser, then the other one is also aser. If one's mutter, the other one's also mutter. Here we're paskening like Abaya. Yes, do you have any questions on this? How many cases do we have that we pasken like Abaya? So officially only 6, right? Yal Kagam.
6.
Very good. So Taisus here asks this amazing question. Taisus v'hilchasa. Teima l'Rebbe. My teacher has a question. Taisus says, we never pasken like Abaya, except for 6 exceptions. And this isn't one of them. This is we pasken like Abaya. He doesn't answer. Okay. Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, now that you said that you can't use the sides of the tree, you have to use the sides of the sides, twice removed, but not the side of the tree itself. So then, Hai Darga, this ladder, the midla that's leaning, don't lean it directly on a tree. Because that would be using the side of the tree. And that's also. Put it on a peg that's sticking out of the tree. The barmi dikla, that's out of the tree. The chisalik, and when you're going up, kari agavazi, don't step onto the peg. Only step on the rungs of the ladder itself. As we learned, that you can use the sides of the sides, but not the side of the tree, not the peg that's directly on the tree. Okay. Following Mishnah. it's very hard to learn because the Gemara has two interpretations of the Mishnah. We'll have to choose one way, and then we'll go back and figure it out. There's a machlekes Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda how to learn this Mishnah in the Gemara. Let's see. We'll go through it. It's the actual machlekes is not complicated. It's just the reading of the Mishnah when you go back to it. The machlekes is pretty simple. Kimatirin piki amr lefnei behema. You're allowed to open up bundles of hay in front of an animal. According to Rav Huna, you're not allowed to make food edible. It's eludei, what's this term? Eludei uchla b'Shabbos. You're giving birth to food on Shabbos. Because the food has to be edible before. You can't make it edible. However, if it is edible, then you're allowed to do whatever you want to prepare for it, even if it's a big tercha, once it's edible. So hay is already edible. So therefore, the fact that it's tied up, you're allowed to open it up and let the animal eat it. You're not giving birth. You're not mashvei uchla or oiludei uchla. You're not making it into food. It was already food. You're allowed to make it more palatable, but you're not allowed to make it into food. So you're allowed to open this. Mefasfasin, asakipin, and you're also allowed to spread out the kipin. Amir and kipin is going to be really the same thing. The question is how many ties it has around it. 2 ties or 3 ties. They bundle things up. How many strings does it have to bundle it? Avalaya sazirin, but you can't. We'll see in a minute. You can't do this to the zirin. It's always a problem when it says 2 things. It says you're allowed to open, means untie, to the hay. You're allowed to spread the kipin, but you're not allowed to do to the zirin. Now, which one, open or spread? It doesn't say. Okay, we'll see in the Gemara. Ein meraskin, you're not allowed to chop up. Leis shachas. Shachas is like a straw. V'leis charuvin, and not carob. Lefnei behema, in front of an animal. Bein daka bein gasa. Now, this would be. Rav Huna learn this. We'll see in the Gemara how Rav Huna is going to learn this. We'll see. The Gemara is going to explain. It's not telling me if it's edible beforehand, before you chop it up. Rav Huna would learn that it's not edible, and that's why you're not allowed to chop it up, because you're making it edible. You're not allowed to make things into food. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin l'daka. Rabbi Yehuda holds that for a small animal, you're allowed to chop up the carob. A small animal. We'll see what small means. There's a very interesting Gemara here. How small? What small actually means. Now, in the Gemara, we're going to have 2 opinions how to learn this Mishnah: Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda. That has nothing to do with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Lai. The Rav Yehuda in the Gemara is Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yecheskel. He's an early Amira. He's a student of Rav and Shmuel. Okay, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna is a student of Rav. Rav Huna says, Heinin Pekiyin, Heinin Kipin. What we said in the Mishnah that you're allowed to untie Pekiyin, which we said was Peki Amir, the bundles of the hay, and the Kipin, you're allowed to spread the Kipin. It's really the same thing. But Pekiyin is tray and Kipin is tlasa. Depends how many ties it has on it. 1 or 2. Both of those are allowed. It's just opening with ties. And zirin, that we said was aser, that is the arzi. That's something else. That is small sprouts, shoots of a cedar tree, which are much harder. That's a problem because over there you're turning it into food. Okay. Bachi kamar, and now Rav Huna explains the Mishnah. You're allowed to untie these bundles of straw in front of any animal. You're also allowed to spread it out. The Mishnah didn't actually say mefasfasin, but in the next case it says mefasfasin. The same thing applies because kipin and pekiyin are the same, and kiyam are the same. The same thing for keeping. Why did it divide it up like that? I don't know. Matirin, one, Mafasusin, he says it's both, the halach is the same by both. Avalaya Zirin, but for the Zirin, you're not allowed to do that. What are you not allowed to do? Anything that you're allowed before, which is both. Leila Fasus, you're not allowed to spread it out, you're not allowed to untie. Amar Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda says, my time of the Rav Huna, what's the reason for Rav Huna? What's Rav Huna telling you? What is the logic behind what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do? Says Kosavar, he holds, the mitrach buchla tarchinon, you're allowed to work hard to, once it's food already. You're allowed to do bothersome work once it's food. But you're not allowed to turn it into food. You can't make it into food. Once it's food already, you can do whatever you want. You can make it more palatable. Rav Yehuda has a different shot. Now we're going to jump to this other shot, which we didn't explain yet. We'll see now how Rav Yehuda learns. He says, Heinin Pekian, Heinin Zirin. Pekian and Zirin are the same thing. Oh, he skips the middle case. So why is one Asr, one's Mutter? Zirin, we said you're not allowed to do. He says, Pekian is tray. Pekian has 2 ties, and Zirin Klasa has 3 ties. And Keepin, which we said you're allowed to, is the Arze. Is these cedar shoots. Rachi Kama, and this is what he means to say. Okay, we have no explanation. What's going on over here? This is Matirin Peki Amr Lifnei Behema. You're allowed to untie straw, the hay, in front of the animal. Aval Pispuse like, but you're not allowed to spread it out. Okay, that's a good reading of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah only said you're allowed to untie. But keepin, when it comes to keepin, which that, according to Rav Yehuda, means cedar shoots, Pispusing namim faspusin, and you're allowed to spread it out as well. What was the explanation? We'll see in a minute what the explanation is. Avaloya zirin lefasris, but you're not allowed to spread out the zirin. El-lahater, but you're allowed to untie them. So the fact that it has 3 ties is not a problem. You're allowed to untie all 3 ties. When it says Avalaya Sazirin, it means you're not allowed to spread it out. Are you allowed to spread out the Amir? Also not. You're only allowed to untie. The order of the Mishnah is a little strange, because what you're allowed to do to Pekian, you're allowed to do to Zirin. Could have told me by both of them, you're not allowed to be mefasvis, you're not allowed to spread it out. So, okay. We need an explanation for what's going on. What is this opinion? Rava, my time with the Rav Yehuda. Rava explains, what's the reason for Rav Yehuda? It's exactly the opposite of Rav Huna. He holds that the animal needs to eat. So I'm not allowed to do anything extra, but I'm allowed to make it into food. Exactly the opposite of Rav Huna. Rav Huna said that you're not allowed to make food. Once it's food, you can do all the extra work you want to make it fancy. Rav Yehuda says exactly the opposite. You're only allowed to make it into the bare, minimal, edible. Once it's edible, then you're not allowed to touch it anymore. If you're allowed to make it food, after that, no more work. You're not allowed to be matriach yourself, to bother yourself anymore once the animal is already able to eat it. Okay. 2 pshatim in the Mishnah. One is you're not allowed to turn it into food. Once it's food, you're allowed to do whatever you want. The other pshat is you're only allowed to turn it into food. But once it's food, you're not allowed to do anything. Okay, Tanan. Now we're going to look at the other part of the Mishnah, and we're going to see if this fits with which side this fits with. Ein meraskin as a shachas. You're not allowed to chop up the hay, the sacharuvin, or the carob, l'fnei behema, in front of an animal, bein daka bein gaser. You're not allowed to do this. Now, what are we talking about? If we're talking about that it's food already, then it's a proof that you're, to Rav Yehuda, you're not allowed to do any extra work. If we're talking about that you're turning it into food, then it's a proof to Rav Huna. It says, my love, is it not charuvin dumya deshachas, that the carob here is similar to the straw, to the hay. Ma shachas derechiche, av charuvin derechiche. Just like the straw is soft, so also the carob is soft. I never really had soft carob. Usually you get the Buxer Tu B'Shvat. I don't even know what it is. So. But I guess there's more fresh and we get it hard. So we must be talking about, if you had those two cases put together, probably the carob is similar to the straw, and it was edible. Both of them are soft. The animal doesn't need it chopped up. So, and you're not allowed to soften it. You're not allowed to chop it up. You're not allowed to make it easier. Alma, it's a proof that that once it's food, you're not allowed to do anything to it. It's Yufta de Rav Huna, it's a Kasha and Rav Huna. Rav Huna said that you're not allowed to make it into food. But once it's food, you're allowed to do whatever you want. You were dealing with food and you're not allowed to. It's a Kasha and Rav Huna. Amlach Rav Huna says, Loi, that's not the pshat. Shachas, dumya de charuvin. You have to look at it exactly the other way. Exactly the other way. That the straw is similar to the carob. Ma charuvin da kushe av shachas da kushe. Just like the carob is hard, so that's what we're used to. So too the straw is hard. Somehow the straw is very hard. And when is the straw considered hard? It says be'ilei zutri. We're talking about. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Be'ilei zutri. We're talking about a young horse, that foal, that it can't eat the straw unless it's chopped up. Rav Huna is saying that we're talking about that you can't chop up the carob because the animal can't eat it until it's chopped up, and you're not allowed to make it into food. You're not allowed to mash ve'yochla. You can't chop up the straw. Normally, animals can eat straw. So do whatever you want to make it more palatable. No, they were dealing with that the animal here is a young horse that can't eat the straw unless it's chopped up. It's like cereal. Okay, so Rav Huna answered this Mishnah, this section of the Mishnah to fit with his pshat. Tashema, come and listen. Rabbi Yehuda Mata b'charuvin ladaka. The end of the Mishnah said that Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to chop up the carob to feed it to a small animal. Ladaka in lagasalai. To a small animal, yes, but not to a big animal. It's going to be an issue. Let's see. If we're going to say, like we said before, if you learn like Rabbi Yehuda, dealing with we're dealing with that it's soft. Yeah, we're dealing with that it's soft. And this is Rabbi Yehuda's pshat, that you're only allowed to turn it into food. Therefore, this is already soft, you can't touch it. If you say that's the pshat, then what does Rabbi Yehuda do? Once it's soft, you're not allowed to make it more palatable. It's already edible. Rabbi Yehuda's pshat. Shiva mashvina, but you're allowed to turn it into food. Hainudaka. I'm sorry. Hainudakam Rabbi Yehuda churuvin ladaka. Nami shiva oichlanu. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says, that you're allowed to cut it up for a small animal because you're allowed to make it into food. Now, a large animal can eat this. So therefore you're not allowed to touch it. But for a small animal, Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to make it into food. If we're dealing with that the carob in the straw are hard, according to Rav Huna's pshat, that you're not allowed to turn it into food. But once it's food already, then you're allowed to do whatever you want to it. Rav Yehuda de Mater b'charuvim ledaka. When Rav Yehuda says that you're allowed to chop it up for a small animal, kol shkein l'gasa. For a small animal, once it's food, I'm allowed to do whatever I want. That's Rav Huna's pshat. So the small animal has a difficulty eating it when it's hard. A larger animal would have no problem. So if Rabbi Yehuda holds that for a small animal, I'm allowed to chop up the carob to make it edible, according to Rav Huna, it had to have been edible before. You're just making it even more palatable, not edible. Making it more palatable, more appetizing. So then for a small animal, I'm allowed to do it. For a large animal, for sure you're allowed to do it because it was food already. For the large animal, for sure it was food. What does it mean that Rabbi Yehuda says that's for a small animal, you're allowed to do this? A small animal. If you can do it for a small animal, you can do it for any animal. What does it mean, ladaka? It's a kasha, strong kasha on Rav Huna. The Gemara says, "Mi sabris daka mamish." Do you think when it says a small animal, it means a small animal? My daka gasa. What does a small animal mean? It means a large animal. Well, my karile daka. So why are you calling it the daka, small animal? Doesn't mean daka. It means the daika buchla. It's picky. For a picky animal, you're allowed to cut it out. It means because once it's already edible, so you're allowed to make it more appetizing. Why are you making it more appetizing? For a picky animal. So it's not that you're making it into food. It was food already, but this animal happens to be picky. And so you're allowed to make it more appetizing for the for this animal. Unbelievable shot. Daka means a large animal. Okay. Mar says Midik Tani Reish, there's a little bit of a problem. Midik Tani Reish bein Daka bein Gasa. But look, the Tanakama said that you're not allowed to cut it up, chop it up for an animal, whether small or big. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and says for a small one, yes. Michlal, this implies to Rabbi Yehuda daka mamish. That Rabbi Yehuda must be talking about a small animal. Daka mamish kama. Kasha. He must be referring to what the Tanakh. He's a continuation of the Tanakama. If the Tanakama used, that's the reference. The Tanakama used the term daka, so Rabbi Yehuda must also be referring to what the Tanakama meant when it said daka. You can't switch the meaning of the word right in the middle. Okay. Tashma. Come and listen. Mechatchen esad luan lefnei behema. You're allowed to chop up the squash or gourd in front of an animal. Vesanavela lefnei aklavim. And you're allowed to cut up a carcass in front of dogs. Okay. These are things that you're allowed to do. So, my love, is it not that the luan dunya dinavela, that the squash is similar to the carcass? Ma nevela derechicha, just like the carcass is soft, it's just flesh. So after luan derechicha, so the squash must also be soft. Al matachin ba'achla. See that even though it's food already, you're allowed to still bother yourself to make it better. Who holds this? This is Rav Huna's pshat. Once it's food, you're allowed to do. It's a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda. It's you have to do Rabbi Yehuda. It's a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says once it's edible, you have to leave it. Here you see, you're allowed to chop it up more. Amalach Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says like nevela The squash it's the opposite, exactly the way we did this before. The carcass is similar to the squash, to the gourd, to the pumpkin. Madaluin that the ashuni, just like the squash is hard, the carcass is also hard. Really? Where do you have hard flesh? Marianne says basar pili, with elephant meat. So Rav Huna holds that you're not allowed to. The Mishnah is telling us this Mishnah over there. There's this Mishnah, and it's going to be the next Mishnah coming in. On the next page. That you're allowed to cut up. You're allowed to cut up the squash. According to Rav Huna, it's talking about where it was soft, so it's food already. According to Rav Yehuda, you're allowed to make it into food because it was very hard. Squash and the meat was also very hard because it was animal meat. Inami, or else Biguryasa Zutri. It's talking about puppies. Those are either small lions or small dogs. So I think Rashi's learning about it's dogs. So it's for puppies. I guess you won't be feeding small lions. That's your work in the zoo. So we're talking about small dogs that you have to cut it up for them. You have to cut it up for them. In other words, for them, it's considered making it into food. Tashema, come and listen. The Tani Rab Chanan min Nardai taught Nefarchinan Teben Vaspasta. You're allowed to. It means to mix. It sounds like it means to crumble. It means to crumble. You're allowed to crumble. Straw and aspasta is some sort of growth, probably alfalfa. You're allowed to crumble them. Uma'arvin and then mix them. That's what it means to mix. Alma, tachin both. 1 second. Both of these things were edible. So what are you telling me that you're allowed to do this? According to Rabbi Yehuda, once it's edible, you're not allowed to touch it. It's a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda. Marianne says teven, when it says straw, it's betivna saria. We're talking about that the straw was rotten. And what you're doing is when you open it up, it makes it more edible. Because I guess it ears out and it could eat the parts that's not rotten, probably. If it would be entirely rotten, then it would be muktzah. We're talking about that it's becoming rotten. And aspasta be'ili zuche. And when we talk about aspasta, we're talking about that it's a small horse that has difficulty eating unless it's crumbled. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only time that it's permissible to deal with the animal food is to turn it into food. So that's what we'll be dealing with here, where you're making it into food. According to Rav Huna, there's no kasha on this. It's food. You're allowed to do whatever you want. According to Rav Yehuda, where you're only allowed to make it into food, we have to come up with these answers. Okay. We got through that Mishnah with the two pshatim. You're not allowed to force feed a camel. Lay darsen. You're also not allowed to do drisa. We'll see what that is. It's also a type of force feeding. Aval malitin. But you're allowed to do halata. It's another type of feeding. Probably putting it in front of the animal for the animal to eat, putting it into its mouth. Ve'in ma'amr nesagalan. And you're not allowed to do imur. Amara. It's a type of feeding to the calves. Gemara's going to explain. Aval malitin, but you're allowed to do halata. There are other types of feeding. Mahalkatin l'tarnagolim. You're allowed to force feed the chickens. Nice nemayim lemorsan. You're allowed to put water into the bran. It's all about feeding animals. Avalei goivlim, but you're not allowed to knead it. If you put water into bran, it's fine, but you can't then start pushing it together. Nice nemayim. You're not allowed to put water in front of bees or in front of doves in the birdhouse. hardisios, but you're allowed to put water in front of the geese, or the chickens, or in front of the Yoini hardisios, which are types of birds that you maintain. Rashi tells us hardisios is because it comes from a place called hardisios, which Steinsaltz says Rhodes, comes from the island, Rhodes. And the other pshat is that it was actually based on Hordus. That Hordus was someone, the king Herod, he was someone that would have these birds, and he had them in his palace. So they're called Yaine Hardisius, the birds of Hordus. It says, Gemara says, "My Einaisa." What does it mean that you're not allowed to force feed? Rabbi Yehuda, Einaisa la'evas b'teich meyad. The word "evas" means a trough. It means you're not allowed to make the animal's stomach into a trough. It means you would stuff it so much that it would be as if there's the animal would get so wide because you push the food in. Miyakiki agavnes is such a thing. You stuff it so much that the stomach would spread out like a trough. Gemara says, yes, there is such a thing. I saw this Arab, Taya is like an Arab peddler, the Achla Kura, Batina Kura. He fed it a core, it's a lot, 30 sa, I think, a lot of grain, and then he put on its back 30 sa. That means that it was, I guess, very wide and was able to put all of that on its back. Okay, so you're not allowed to force feed the animal. And the expression that's used for force feeding is to turn its insides into a trough. Ein ma'amirin. We also said that you're not allowed to be mamir to the agolim, to the calves. Ezu amra ve'ezu halata. Halata you were not allowed to do either. I'm sorry, you are allowed to do halata. You're not allowed to do amir. So what's the difference between the two? Amar Rab Yehuda hamra l'makom she'niachil lahachzer, halata l'makom she'niachil lahachzer. It depends how far you're pushing it in. If you're pushing it in past the part of the throat where you won't be able to get it back up, that's asr, that's ma'amirin. But if you're just pushing it into a place where it would be able to quaff it back up, so then that's allowed. That's halata. That's the opinion of Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda we just had before. He had his other opinions about what you're allowed to do to animal food. It's a student of Rav and Shmuel. Rav Chizda Amar, Rav Chizda says, Idi bidi l'makom she'niachil lahachzer. Both of them, both hamra and halata, hamara and halata, are where you're pushing the food to a place where the animal can't bring it back up. It's force feeding. Hamra bekeli and as halatas biyad. It depends if you're using an instrument or if you're doing it by hand. If you're using an instrument to push it in, that's asr. But if you do it by hand, that's permissible. Masav Rav Yosef has a question. You're allowed to force feed the chickens. And for sure, you're allowed to do malkitin, which I think means just to put the food out and I'll eat. But you're not allowed to feed the yoni shaybach, that means the doves of the birdhouse. The doves of the attic. For sure, you're not allowed to force feed them. My mahalkatin. What does it mean force feed? My malkitin, and what was permissible to do, which was just to feed it. Ilema mahalkatin. What is if you say mahalkatin? What you're not allowed to do is to suffer libiyadayim. That means to feed it by hand, force feed it by hand. So Rav Chizda said that the difference between what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do is if it's by hand or with the utensil. Rav Yehuda said both of them didn't matter. It just depends how far you pushed it in. So if you say that mahalkatin, which you're not allowed to do, means that you're doing it by hand, that would be according to Rav Yehuda. In malkitin is the shad l'kamayo. Malkitin just means that you're throwing it in front of him. Michlal, that would imply the yoni shevach, the yoni aliyah, mishta kamaya namilai. We said that you're not allowed to throw food in front of these birds, if that's the pshat. If the pshat is that you're just not allowed to put the food in front of them, you're not allowed to put birds in front of the doves. Elalav, yeah, we need a new pshat. That mahalkatin l'makom she'nechel lahachzer. Mahalkatin means that it's very deep, and it can't bring it back. And malkitin is l'makom she'nechel lahachzer. And malkitin is less, where it can cough it, make it come back. M'chlal damra b'keli. Obviously, hamra must mean that you're using a utensil, because if both of these are two other terms, mahalkatin and malkitin, a little bit similar. Mahalkatin is very deep, and malkitin is not so deep. So then what's hamra? Hamra must mean using a utensil. So Tifta de Rabbi Yehuda, it's a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda said that hamra was very deep, and mahalkatin was not so deep. It's a kasha. And so Samalach Rabbi Yehuda says, I can learn this Mishnah totally different. Laila mahalkatin the safar libiyadayim, malkitin the shad l'kamayim. Let's go back to the way we learned it before. Mahalkatin is to force feed, and malkitin means just to put the food out. The kashalach. You said that you're not allowed to put food in front of doves. It depends if they're expecting you to feed it. It's not expectations here. It has to do with how do they live. If the way that these animals survive is by the owner feeding it, so then you're allowed to feed it. If the way they survive is by getting their own food, then you're not allowed to feed it. Kedatanya, we'll start in a brayse. You're allowed to give food to a dog. You're not allowed to feed a pig. What's the difference between the dog and the pig? Depends how these survive. The dog is surviving from your food, and the pig just eats whatever scraps it finds. So if it's not on you to feed it, then you're not allowed to feed it, and that would explain back to the birds. Those birds find their own food, so you're not allowed to feed them. And then we can now explain that the two examples of force feeding, one was when it was very deep, and one was when it wasn't so deep, and that would fit with Rabbi Yehuda's pshat. If you look at the Mishnah, you can see this in the Mishnah as well. You're not allowed to put water in front of the bees or in front of the birds of the birdhouse. But you're allowed to put it in front of those other animals, which is the geese and the chickens, and in front of the birds from roads. My timer, what's the reason? It has to do with if you're responsible to feed it. If you're responsible to feed it, then you're allowed to. If you're not responsible to feed it, then you're not allowed to. That's what you want to say. According to your reasoning, why does it say that you're allowed to put water in front of those geese and the chickens? Why does it say you're allowed to? Or why does it say you're not allowed to put water? Water was a problem for the birds, right? You weren't allowed to put water out for those birds. You can't put out the grain either. Where it says, grain you're actually allowed to put there. But the water, it finds its own water. But the grain, you have to give it. So therefore, even in animals that you're responsible for, you divide it up between things that it's expecting you to have and things that it can find on its own. So if it can't find the grain, then you give it grain. But if it can, and if it can find water, then you're not allowed to give it water. Darash Rabbi Yaina Apischa de Benasiya. Rabbi Yaina taught an entranceway to the door of the Nasi's house. Says like this. Quotes a pasuk in Mishlei. My diksiv, Yedei Tzadik Din Dalim. The Tzadik knows what's going on with the poor. Now, maybe it means why the poor are poor. Maybe it means the suffering of the poor. Now, the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yaina explains this. It's an interesting Rabbi Yaina. Yedei HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'kelev shemenezenosav muatin v'tikach sheich lasav me'akim al yamim. Hashem knows that the dog does not get a lot of food. So therefore, it has a very slow digestion. And it takes 3 days for the food to digest. Kiditanan, we have a Mishnah that supports this. Let's say an animal, a dog, ate flesh of a corpse, human flesh. Now, while the animal is alive, the animal is not considered tummy. It's called tumah balua, tumah that's absorbed, and the tumah doesn't go out. So if the dog would walk into a house, the house won't become tummy. But if the animal dies, then it's not considered absorbed tumah. It's considered that the tumah would spread out because it's not really contained in a container. There's nothing really containing it. It's all flesh there. But the problem is that you still have the piece of the corpse that's inside. So the tumah would spread out. The question is, was that piece digested? Mishnah says like this: the kelev gimel yamim meis leis. Depends if the animal died, if it ate it within 3 days. If it ate it within 3 days and the animal died, then it's not digested and the tumah goes out. However, when it comes to birds and fish, the digestion takes place as long as it takes to take that food or flesh and throw it into a fire and burn. Is it digested like as if there's a fire inside and burning it up? Okay, Amar Rav Hamnuna Shmamina. Rav Hamnuna says from this you see oirech ara, that it's derech eretz, or it's appropriate. L'mishtiyum tzela kalba, to throw food to a dog. If Hashem gives food to the dog, then it's okay to feed the dog. Bekama, how much should you feed it? Amar Rav Mari. Rav Mari gives you advice. He says mashach udnei, the amount of its ear. That's how much meat you give it. But then hit it with a stick. The reason is because you don't want it to start following you all around, once you fed it. So you have to give it some spanking. Keep it away from you after you feed it. Hani mili bedabra, but that's in the fields. Don't give it any food in the city. It's going to follow you all around. Amar Rav Papa says, less the ani mikalba. There's no one poorer than a dog. Less the atim yechazira, and there's no one wealthier than a pig. Now, Rashi explains that a dog is particular. It doesn't say that, but that's what it's understood. And the pig is very not particular about what it eats. So it's not particular about what it eats. It has all the food in the world. It's a wealthy animal. And but the dog is poor. What can it eat? It needs it specific ways. Okay. Tani Kavasei Rav Yehuda. It's a brisa that supports Rav Yehuda that said the difference is in what you're allowed to, how you're allowed to feed the animal is how far it gets pushed in. Ezu Amra Be'ez Halata. What is the difference in Amra and halata, which are the two types of feeding? One was prohibited and one was permissible. It says like this: Hamra is marbitza. You sit the animal down. You put something in the mouth that doesn't allow it to close its jaw. Machilin karshinim, you give it karshinim, which is fetch. I'm sorry. Karshinim umayim bevasachas. Karshinim umayim bevasachas. You give it water with fetch together. That's hamra. That means it goes in all the deep. And halata is machila mu'umad. You feed it while the dog is standing. It's a dog. We said an animal, a camel. And you give it to drink standing. So in other words, when it's the dog is not the dog, the animal is sitting down, and you force its mouth open. So then the food together with the water is going to go to a place of the throat where it can't get it back up. However, if the animal is standing, then it's not going to go, can't get it so deep. So that's why it's permissible. And also you give the water separately, so it doesn't go in as far because it's not as soft. You're allowed to force feed the chicken. Abaya says, I said in front of Rabbah, his teacher. Masnisin Mani, who's the author of our Mishnah? Or Mali Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Says the author is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. We'll see. The Tanya was taught in a brisa. If one person put flour and one person put water, the second person is chayiv, because putting water into flour is automatically considered kneading, and you're not allowed to knead dough on Shabbos. Rabbi Yossi says no, putting the water in is not kneading. Kneading is when you mix it together and you squish it together, that's kneading. So adding the water is not a problem. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda would fit with our Mishnah that said, you're allowed to put water into bran. Rabbi would hold that you're not allowed to, because that's considered kneading. The Gemara says, one second. When did Rabbi Yossi say over there that you're allowed to add water, it's not considered kneading? Because by flour, there's another step to it. You can still knead it, and you didn't knead it, so it's not a problem. Aval. But by the bran, where there is no really kneading after you add the water, it doesn't mix and turn into a paste. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda would agree that adding the water itself is considered kneading in this case, because there is no second step. Don't think like that. The Tanya behedya, because we have a clear brisa. Rabbi holds you not allowed to add water. What are we talking about here? Not kemach, not flour, but morson, which is bran. And Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda clearly says that you're allowed to add water to bran. That means the author of our Mishnah would be Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Tana Rabbana was taught in the Brisa saying, you're not allowed to knead sweet toasted flour on Shabbos. Yeshayim Goivlin. Some say you are allowed to knead. Asks, Man Yeshayim. Who's the Yeshayim? It's a very interesting question because we know that the Yeshayim is Rav Nassim. That's what Tosfos asks over there on the side if you see. Ayin Mashkas of Tosfos. So whatever the case is, Amar Rav Chisda says Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. He's the one that holds that you're allowed to knead. That you're allowed to knead. Really, you're allowed to knead? According to Rebbe, once you add water, then that's considered kneading. According to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, there is a second step. So, if you don't knead it in the normal fashion, as we're about to say, then it could be that it's mutter. Bahani Mili, Gemara goes on. It says, when do we say that you're allowed to do this? You're allowed to knead the keli, which is this toasted flour. It says that's only hud mashani. That's only if you do it in an abnormal way. Then it's allowed. Eichi mashani, what's considered an abnormal way? You do just small amounts. And everyone holds that you're allowed to stir with a spoon. Shassis. Shassis is a drink that has flour and and water and honey. Sort of like a porridge, but it's liquid. You're allowed to stir it on Shabbos. No, it's not so clear. It's flour and water. It's like kneading. This is what this Mishnah says. This brisa. We'll see in a moment. And you're also allowed to drink zeisem amitri, which is some sort of Egyptian beer. And even though that was medicinal, but they hold over here that it's not medicinal. People, healthy people drink it as well. The Gemara says, but the Tanakama of the Brisa says you're not allowed to knead. Now you're telling me you're allowed to stir the shasas? There's a problem. This is like kasha baba barach. It depends how thick the consistency is. If it's thick, then it's a problem. If it's liquid, then it's not. Bahani mili the mishani. And this also, even this is only if you do it in an abnormal way. Heichem mishani, how do you do it in an abnormal way? Rabbi Yosef says, in the weekday, what would be normal is you do the vinegar, and then you add in the shasas, which is the water with flour. So therefore, if that's the normal way, then b'Shabbos you do it the other way. B'Shabbos you add in, you put in the container first the flour and water liquid, and then you add in the vinegar afterwards, and that would be considered abnormal. Levi, Breder the Rav Huna bar Chia, Levi the son of Rav Huna bar Chia, Gavla the Beinasha. This must be the person that feeds the animals. He mixes the food for the animals. Beinasha sounds like his father's house. The Kagavla v'Safila, he was kneading it, and then he was feeding the oxen. Batishbei, Levi kicked the fellow. Doesn't sound so nice. He held that it was asur to knead it on Shabbos. Asavua, the father came ashkechet, found what he did. Amalei hachi amar avua di imach. Your mother's father said the following: Mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav Amanu. Who is his mother's father? Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said in the name of Rav, Goyvlin v'loy mesafen. You're allowed to knead, but you're not allowed to stuff it in the mouth. But an animal that can't eat on its own, a young calf, you're allowed to feed it. When did we say this? That's only if you do it in an abnormal way. In other words, we said that you're allowed to knead it. In the name of Rav says you're allowed to knead it. How do you do it in an abnormal way? You knead it by not mixing it like this. You mix it like backwards and forwards, like a X. So it's volei marav shaper, but it won't mix well. Rav Yehuda gives another way of doing this. It says you pour it from one utensil to another, and that's how it mixes. Ksiva Pinkas of the Ziri was written on the ledger in the notebook of Ziri. Amris Kadam Rebbe. I said in front of my teacher, Umanu, who is his teacher? It's like a parenthetical. Reb Chia. Didn't say that in his notebook. His teacher was Reb Chia. Ma'al legabel. Are you allowed to knead the food on Shabbos? Amar Asi, he says that's not allowed. Ma'al lefarik. What about changing from one trough to another, from putting it from one animal to another? Farik usually means to taking something out of its container. Here it means taking it from one container, putting it into another. Amar Moti, he says that's allowed. Amar Menashe. Menashe said, Chad, one trough, kamei chad, you're allowed to put in front of one animal. Tray, two troughs, kamei tray, shapidam, in front of two animals is good, one for each. Plus a kamei tray also, but to put three in front of two animals, that's not allowed. That's too much of a tircha, and it's not necessary for the animal. This is going according to that opinion that says ush uchla. I'm not sure if it's only following Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef Amar kav afilu kabayim. Rabbi Yosef says you're allowed to put a kav or even two kav, which is a large amount. Ula Amar korv afilu kurayim. Ula says even a korv, it's a huge amount, 30 sa. Even 2 kor. Kasav apinkas of the Levi was written on the ledger of Levi. Amris kadam Rebbe was said in front of Rebbe, or I said in front of Rebbe. Amris kadam Rebbe. Umano, who is the Rebbe? Rabbeinu HaKadosh. It means Rabbi Dan Nasi. Al the Havagavlin Shisa Babel said that they were mixing Shasisa and Babel, which is that drink that we spoke about. Avitzavach Rebbe. They were kneading it. Rebbe screamed about it. Manu Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Al the Havagavlin Shisa, that they would do this. But no one would listen to him. And he didn't have the strength to say it's prohibited. Neither Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda allowed it. Kasav Apinka said to Rabbi Shua ben Levi. It was written on the ledger of Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Haiman de Bechada b'Shabbat. This person that's born on a Sunday, Yegever b'Leichadabe, will be a powerful person, be no one like him. What does it mean? My b'Leichadabe, there's no one else like him. Ilem b'Leichadativa, there's no one like him for good. I'm sorry. B'Leichadabe, there's not. He doesn't have one. B'Leichadabe, he doesn't have one. What does it mean? He doesn't have one. Doesn't mean he doesn't have one good thing. He has nothing good in him. There's a problem. I was born on a Sunday. What do you mean? There's nothing good in me? Ravashi, or the Gemara is asking that. Ravashi was born on a Sunday. Elalav chadal labisha. There's nothing bad in him. Gemara says, well, that's a problem as well. Ravashi says, Anavadimi bar kakuzta havit b'chad b'shaba. Anam melech v'aviresh ganvi. Ravashi says that I and this fellow Dimi bar Kakusta were born on the same Sunday, and I became the head of the yeshiva. He became the head of the thieves. So ella ikulu tivi kulu bishu. Rather, it's either totally good or totally bad. My time at different bay or v'cheshach, because light and darkness were created then. I'm the b'shei b'Shabbat. Someone born on a Monday, gavaragzan. He's going to be angry. My time is from the fliga bay maya, because the waters were divided. It's a contentious day. I'm on the betlasa b'Shabbat. Someone that's born on a Tuesday. Gever ater v'zanai. He'll be wealthy, and he'll also be an adulterer. V'zanai. My time, mishum divrei bay asavim, because it was created the grasses. Now the grasses, they reproduce, and there's also a lot of them, and they sustenance one to another. Haiman de barba b'Shabbos. If you're born on a Wednesday, you go bar chakim b'nai, you'll be wise and shining. My time is from ditl b'mayris, because that's when the sun and the moon and the lights of the heaven. Haiman de b'chamisha b'Shabbos. You're born on a Thursday, you gaver goymel chasadim, will be a kind person. My time is from divri bay dagav vayfis, because the fish and the birds were created, and they get their food without work. Haiman de mali shabbata. If he's born on Friday, you gaver chazran. Well, you're running after mitzvahs, because on Friday everyone runs to do mitzvahs, mopping the floor. Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak chazran b'mitzvahs. He is explaining. Haiman de b'Shabbata. Anyone that's born on Shabbos, yehi b'Shabbata. Haiman de b'Shabbata, yehi b'Shabbata yamas. If it's born on Shabbos, he'll die on Shabbos. Al dechilu eleyu yoima. Rabba the Shabbat, al dechiliyim Rabba the Shabbat, because they violated Shabbos for him, so he'll die on Shabbos. Amar Rabba bar Rav Shila v'Kadisha Rabba Yiskarei, and Rav Shila says that he'll be very holy. Okay, let's stop right there.